Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm Jane Mellsop from the Asia Society Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. We're pleased that you're able to join us for what I'm sure will be a very interesting webinar today. The focus for today's discussion is the impact of the United States friendshoring policy in the Indo-Pacific and how international supply chains can be further strengthened in this rather uncertain trade world that we're all living in now. The second term of the Trump administration has been in place for just over 6 weeks, although for many of us working on trade issues, it feels like a lot longer than that. President Trump's actions and announcements and the pace of change is being felt keenly all around the world. We've new 20% tariffs on China, 25% tariffs for Canada and Mexico, plus proposed tariffs for all trading partners on a range of products are all being closely watched by our Asian friends and partners. The promise of reciprocal tariffs coming down the line from President Trump and his team are ringing alarm bells in many capitals as well. The administration has been clear that manufacturing needs to move back to the US. At the same time, a number of our Indo-Pacific partners will have also welcomed indications that the administration is interested in looking at trade deals, something that our trade friends sorely missed during the Biden administration. So what does all this mean for friendshoring? The last administration put considerable effort into working with friends and allies in the Indo-Pacific to strengthen important supply chains. They launched a number of initiatives like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, Minerals Security Partnership, and the Chip4 Alliance. Friendshoring was pursued in light of the US concerns around overdependence on China and the need to be better prepared for supply chain shocks. Yesterday, Asia Society Policy Institute released a paper examining US friendshoring policy. I encourage you to check it out on the ASPI website after this. For now, though, I'm very pleased that we have such a great panel of experts from both the US and Asia to explore how the Indo-Pacific region can navigate this new trade world. Let me briefly introduce our panelists today. We're pleased that Iman Pambagyo is able to join us from Indonesia. Iman was formerly the Chief Trade Negotiator for Indonesia, with extensive experience in free trade agreement negotiations, including ASEAN FTAs and RCEP. Welcome, Iman. We also welcome Jayant Menon joining our panel today from Singapore. Jayant is a senior fellow at ISEAS, Yusof Ishak Institute, and he previously served as lead economist in the office of the chief economist at Asia Development Bank. Welcome, Jayant. Also joining us from Asia, we have Professor Yasuyuki Todo from the Graduate School of Economics at Waseda University in Tokyo. He is actively engaged in research on international trade, supply chains, and economic resilience. Welcome, Professor Todo. And finally, we are pleased that we have Wendy Cutler joining us to share an important US perspective today. Wendy is Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute and a former acting Deputy USTR. So thank you to our stellar panel for joining today, especially our panelists from Asia who are joining us late into your evening. Just a reminder that our panelists today will be speaking in their personal capacities. We'll get right onto the questions next, but just before we do, I want to let our audience know that we're keen to incorporate your questions into our discussion, so please do submit questions in the Q&A box. And I encourage you to keep the questions short, please. Now let's get on to our discussion. Wendy, I'm going to start with you, please. President Trump seems to be making a number of demands of the United States friends and allies. His tariff hikes look to many like the US trade policy is shifting toward a more protectionist stance and highlights his desire to bring production home, as we just mentioned. So, Wendy, what do you see as the key impacts of Trump's tariffs on friendshoring policy? And how do you see a friendshoring strategy evolving under this administration? Over to you, Wendy.
Well, thanks, Jane. And it's really my pleasure to join you and such a distinguished group from Asia. And I'm particularly interested in hearing the Asian perspective, but let me just share a bit about the US perspective. I mean, clearly, as we convene this morning, we are waking up to what looks like an emerging trade war between the United States and its three largest trading partners, Canada, Mexico, and China. Following the imposition of U.S. tariffs at midnight last night, China did not skip a beat and has imposed targeted tariffs on a number of agricultural products, but has also taken other steps, including blacklisting some U.S. companies. Canada has also set in motion its tariff retaliation package, really trying to target politically sensitive products in the United States. Mexico, not far behind, but my understanding is we'll hear more about Mexico's plans to respond later this morning. So in some ways, with all of this happening, it seems a bit strange to talk about friendshoring in this environment. But nevertheless, I think it's an important conversation to have, because even though if tariffs have eclipsed the discussion of the need for resilient and secure supply chains, it's only a matter of time, in my view, before the issue of supply chains comes to the fore again, particularly given that businesses really need to navigate the challenges and pressures of the global economy. So now just over to the America First trade agenda. Look, that's really suggesting that America's preference is to make everything at home. It sounds to some in the United States as a laudable objective, but to many realists, they recognize it's not possible. And so it does seem a bit inevitable that the administration over time will revisit the need to build secure and resilient supply chains, particularly with our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region. And to take a favorable view of the reports assigned in the executive order issued at the beginning of the Trump administration, with the reports due to the White House April 1st, I was pleasantly surprised by a reference to a report looking at additional countries the United States could pursue trade agreements with. But also, it also referenced soliciting ideas for plurilateral sectoral agreements. And while, some may think of these as pure trade agreements, I think that could really open the door for creating supply chains with like-minded countries, something that you could call in the neighborhood of friendshoring. Undoubtedly, over the coming months, our policies are going to be shifting. There's going to be pressure and a lot of developments in terms of working with our friends. But I do think one goal will become more and more important, and that will be the need to continue to reduce reliance on China. From a U.S. perspective, that's extremely important. And so I think that's where friendshoring can also come into the debate. And finally, I would just make the point that, with respect to everything else now, maybe friendshoring isn't the right word to be using now. And maybe we need to be thinking about what's a different phrase that might resonate better in Washington and more aligned with the America First strategy to enhance U.S. competitiveness. And here I would just stress that working with like-minded countries on supply chains should focus on complementing our domestic production rather than replacing it. So let me then turn it over to others, but I wanted just to put those thoughts on the table. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Wendy, and glad to hear that we've got a few options out there still, and that it's not all completely over. So I'd now like to turn to our Asia experts. I'm going to start with you, Jay. So Southeast Asian countries, have emerged as a key hub for US friendshoring efforts over recent years, especially in terms of how they might replace China as a manufacturing hub of choice. And as Wendy mentioned, that's something we're talking about a lot, is reducing dependence on China. What's your perspective from on the ground in Asia as to how the latest tariff actions and various threats from President Trump of more tariffs coming down the pipeline, how might that affect ASEAN's role in global supply chains? And what should the countries in Southeast Asia be doing to stay competitive and relevant to the US as a friendshoring destination? So over to you, Jay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Jane. And let me start by thanking the Asia Society Policy Institute for having me back again to talk about this. Very timely in light of what's happened today. So from Asia's point of view, or more specifically ASEAN's point of view, or Southeast Asian countries at least, certainly have benefited from US-China rivalry so far through investment diversions, looking to bypass the original Trump 1.0 tariffs, if you like. Tariffs which President Biden not only retained, but actually expanded. We know now that President Biden was the bigger protectionist than Trump 1.0. We'll have to see whether that's true for Trump 2.0. Only time will tell. But certainly many countries, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, perhaps the main beneficiaries in ASEAN from the type of relocation of supply chains with the focus on trying to avoid these bilateral tariffs on China. So I wouldn't just call it US friendshoring. A lot of the investments have involved Chinese firms looking to bypass them. But of course, foreign firms, including US firms, have also had to reduce or remove Chinese value added in order to not be subject to these Trump tariffs, Trump 1.0 tariffs. Now, this, I think, is beginning to change, and it started under Biden, especially the last package of punitive measures, where we have seen a shift from nationality of firms, from location of firms to nationality of firms. So this is the shift from the so-called made in China to made by China. So the U.S. customs authorities have been hard at it, trying to stop the workarounds that are trying to avoid these tariffs by just relocating to third countries. So to the extent that they're successful in doing this, and they're working very hard at it, and they've got quite good at it, relocating just to avoid tariffs on China will no longer be a worthwhile exercise. These relocations involve costs, not just one-off fixed costs, but also the fact that they're moving out of China, the preferred location, to another location means that there are efficiency losses as well. They're not producing in the site of preferred choice. But also compliance costs of these measures on exporters to the US and importers in the US are rising sharply as a result. It's already so difficult to work out where a product is produced, in what shares these days because of global supply chains. Now, if you're trying to clamp down on these measures, the kind of documentation that customs is requiring logistics firms to provide, some of which is sometimes quite almost impossible, but it's certainly very difficult to provide, is raising compliance costs. That is non-negligible now, that aspect of it. So the last part of your question asks what ASEAN should do. Now, so far, the often repeated mantra has been ASEAN should not pick sides, they should remain neutral, and not get pulled in one direction or the other, because both the US and China are important trade and investment partners. And I agree with this approach. The question now is that, will it last if Trump starts targeting individual countries? We've already heard about Vietnam being on the radar, right? We have seen that the temptation to retaliate is often overwhelming. Today, all countries that have been subject to tariffs have retaliated. We know that the best economic action is to do nothing in the face of tariffs imposed on you, because tariffs hurt the country imposing them more than they do anyone else. So, but it's going to be difficult because the political economy is such that doing nothing is very difficult to sell to a domestic electorate that sees this as an attack on their sovereignty. Finally, I think there is a bit of a silver lining, and that is that if President Trump keeps raising tariffs on more and more countries, then the net impact on any one country will be reduced. It's all about relativities, of course, when it comes to competitiveness. So an across-the-board tariff, for instance, on all trading partners doesn't actually change your competitiveness, but it does raise costs to consumers. And of course, it's a tax on producers who use imported inputs for export. So it's a tax on exports at home. But if this does happen, then it does sort of even up an already very uneven playing field. And so individual countries may not be marginalized to the same extent, but in a sense, prices go up, consumer welfare is lost, and producer welfare too. So no one really wins, but let's wait and see who are the next victims of these tariff increases. So far in this region, no one's been targeted, but that can change. Let me stop there and turn back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jay. And I certainly like your reference to a silver lining. And I think that's, it's a very interesting point that obviously it will affect everyone the same if it's a global tariff. I guess some companies will be able to wear that better than others. But thanks very much for those comments. Let's turn to Professor Todo now, and let's have a look at Japan. Jay just mentioned how Vietnam is going to be in the spotlight, given the trade deficit there. Japan is in a similar position. In 2024, Japan had a 68.5 billion trade surplus, making it the seventh largest contributor to the US trade deficit. So with Trump's focus on reducing these trade imbalances, I guess Japan is also going to be have a light shined on it. So at the same time, we've got US efforts to diversify from China. We've got ongoing challenges to supply chains. Really, the US does need stronger ties with trusted partners like Japan. How do you think a country like Japan can solidify its role as a trusted friendshoring partner while addressing concerns over its surplus? Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Jane. Basically, I like to talk from the perspective of the Japanese economy. So in this very unusual situation, Japan should create a win-win situation, relationship with the U.S. And in other words, Japan should share economic profits with the U.S. as a trusted partner, not only for friendshoring, but also for onshoring and reshoring of the U.S. So for this purpose, I'd like to propose three strategies. So first, Japan has to deal with this trade deficit of the U.S. And in its own, as well as its own onshoring strategy. So I like to suggest Japanese companies to increase investment to produce in the U.S. So this is exactly what President Trump expects, and it may be helpful to avoid tariffs on Japan's exports to the U.S. in the future. And actually, investment from Japan to the U.S. is increasing recently. And Prime Minister Shiba has also promised more investment in the last Japan's U.S. summit. But looking at the first year of Trump 1.0, 2017, investment from Japan to the U.S. declined drastically. This is possibly because of uncertainty of policies at that time. So we need to avoid this will happen again this time. The Japanese government should collaborate with the U.S. government to reduce policy uncertainty in Trump 2.0. And second, the relocation of production plants to the U.S. too much may result in inefficiency of Japanese companies, as Jay already mentioned. So to create a win-win and sustainable relationship, Japan needs to maintain exports of our major products such as automobile parts, chip making machinery, and steel, in addition to the investment in the U.S. So, for example, China's share in U.S. imports of automobile parts is declining. However, reshoring may not cover all the reduction. So the U.S. still needs new trusted partners like Japan, as Wendy mentioned already. And this friendshoring benefits the U.S. as diversifying partners can create resilient supply chains. And finally, in addition to strengthen supply chains between Japan and the U.S., we need to strengthen the knowledge network between the two countries, including research collaboration. I want to call such expansion of knowledge networks to trusted partners knowledge friendshoring. Actually, Wendy already mentioned that friendshoring may not be an appropriate word now, but for the time being, I want to call it friendshoring. And both Japan and the U.S. can benefit from this friendshoring. Because one of my empirical studies find that any country, including the U.S. and Japan, has benefited from international research collaboration through learning new knowledge from foreign partners. And recently, supply chain relationships are often associated with research collaboration. So if Japanese companies investing in the U.S. will conduct joint research with the U.S. companies and universities, Japan's investment in the U.S. will not lead to inefficiency, but innovation in Japan. Unfortunately, recently, Japanese companies in the semiconductor industry, such as Rapidus and Tokyo Electron, are actively conducting joint research with U.S. and other foreign companies such as IBM, Intel, and TSMC. So these collaborations are supported, and also I want to emphasize that these collaborations are supported by industry policy of the Japanese government. Okay, so I want to emphasize that Japan is a trusted partner of the U.S. for friendshoring and also for knowledge friendshoring. And we can create a win-win relationship. But still, we need some policies and some negotiation. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Todo. Yeah, those are a lot of good ideas, and I hope that Japanese policymakers are listening as well, so we can follow up with some of those and as you say, create a win-win situation. So Iman, I'm going to pivot to Indonesia's experience now. So as countries look to diversify their supply chains, Indonesia has been positioning itself as a supply chain hub, and we are seeing it developing its manufacturing sector. Can you outline for us a bit about what's driving these shifts in production to Indonesia? What policies is Indonesia pursuing to become a more attractive destination for investment? And where do you see the new Trump administration's policies impacting Indonesia the most? Over to you, Iman.
Thank you, Jen, and let me express my appreciation for inviting me to join this panelist. So we have 3 questions there. What drives Indonesia's shift to production hub? So I believe Indonesia is home to some critical minerals and other important commodities such as timber, rubber, pepper, fisheries, palm oil, to name just a few. What Indonesia wishes to do is climbing the ladder of supply chains and put ourselves broader in the global trade map, commensurate with Indonesia's economic potentials. And what has been done, or what kind of policy that is being pursued in Jakarta? As we just have a new government in Jakarta last January, businesses and observers are still grappling with the question of what is the grand policies that Indonesia will pursue in the context of global trade and economic challenges these days. I think the development in Washington, D.C. and responses shown by U.S. old friends in recent days, weeks, and months has reinforced Jakarta's tendency to be more inward-looking and leaning toward a tit-for-tat approach. It is not something that I myself would necessarily agree, but that's the point. I think Trump administration policies is impacting Indonesia in 2 broad ways. The first is that unpredictability is the only thing that we can predict. What should we do to be considered as friend, while the term itself should work both ways? I feel that U.S. is my friend, but it doesn't necessarily mean that U.S. will feel or take Indonesia as the friends, right? There was a saying, amicus meus inimicus inimici mei, or the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But it seems today that what prevails now is the enemy of my enemy is my enemy too, so long as such an enemy cannot go along with my other interests. And the second, the administration policies do not tolerate the presence of China's footprints in our product to pass the criteria as a U.S. friend. For sure, Indonesia continues to praise our strategic relation with the United States, but at the same time, we value China's participation in our and ASEAN economic development. I think what Indonesia needs to do is to stay neutral or to be perceived as neutral in the context of great rivalry between the United States and China. So I stop there.
Thanks very much, Iman, and really valuable to hear those perspectives from on the ground in Indonesia and how you're viewing it. I think that certainty is certainly something that we talked about in our recent SB report, looking at friendshoring as well as something that we want to move towards. So I'm going to turn back to Wendy now, and something that also Iman touched on, I guess, is what the US can actually offer to partners. And one of the criticisms we have heard in the past is a real lack of market access incentives for partners. So as you mentioned, Wendy, the administration has made some noises about doing deals and sectoral agreements and perhaps even plurilateral ones. What's your take on what the new administration will be able to offer its partners in these sorts of negotiations? And if not market access, what can the US offer to make these partnerships more beneficial to our Asia friends? Over to you, Wendy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would not assume that market access would be off the table in any trade negotiation that the Trump administration pursues. In fact, if you look at Trump 1.0, particularly the agreement with Japan, although we didn't cut as many tariffs as Japan did, we did cut some tariffs. And my sense is that if you look at the progress Trump 1.0 made with the UK, and there's talk now about concluding a deal with the UK, that would also include market access. But I think we need to be realistic here is that the U.S. is going to be under pressure not to provide a lot of market access and to be more maybe creative on what they can offer other partners. And here, I mean, one thing I think would be extremely important for any trade negotiation during the Trump administration is that a partner would want the assurance that they're not going to be subject to any more tariff increases. Now, I'm going to put aside those tariff increases associated with anti-dumping and countervailing duty, because even in our free trade agreements, that we've concluded over the past 30 years, those tariffs, continue. But, this barrage of whether sectoral tariffs or reciprocal tariffs or country tariffs, that I think any country would want that certainty that if they reach some kind of trade deal with the Trump administration, that they want to be guaranteed that they're not going to be subject to additional tariff initiatives announced by the White House. Also, I don't think you can discount the other important areas and offers and rules that have been part of traditional U.S. free trade agreements, including those negotiated during Trump 1.0. So whether it be customs or whether it be in the area of services or investment, these agreements do provide certainty and rules that the U.S. will agree to. What will be interesting to me is whether the administration will be pursuing kind of more of these traditional like free trade agreements, if indeed they go ahead, like the UK agreement, or they may start looking at more creative ways to move forward. And here I know there's going to be a real push to tighten and strengthen rules of origin, but let me put that aside. But what I wanted to kind of talk about, given the subject of our discussion today, is what could, for example, you put in plurilateral sectoral agreements that help promote a supply chain among those countries. And here, I do think that the U.S. can offer a number of things, including the idea of, that Professor Todo shared about whatever you want to call it, intellectual or knowledge friendshoring, that maybe there could be like joint R&D collaboration. I think the U.S. has an interest in working with other countries to improve their customs services, for example. And that doesn't have to be viewed as the U.S. giving aid to a country. I think it's also in our interest that customs procedures move smoothly in our major export markets as well. So, again, I think there is a lot that could be put on the table, but I also think we should be prepared for kind of a new model of a trade agreement emerging from the Trump administration. And I would hope that new model would look seriously at some of these broader supply chain concerns. Because when I think of trade agreements going forward, particularly plurilateral sectoral agreements, in my mind, they seem not only to be trade agreements, but also potentially supply chain agreements.
Thanks very much, Wendy. And great to hear the idea that we might be moving forward with deals and the options there might be for new models. And just building on that, if I could just turn to Jay now, I wonder, Wendy's talked about new models and potential for new deals. I'm wondering if we could look at new areas as well, expanding digital trade and technology partnerships with trusted allies and friends as well. So we know that ASEAN is working on its own digital trade agreement. There's obviously hope that the new US administration might be willing to look again at digital policy. What potential do you see, Jay, for US-ASEAN cooperation in areas like semiconductors, AI, digital infrastructure? What can we do to facilitate digital trade? And what policy adjustments do you think would be necessary on both sides in order to facilitate stronger collaboration in this space?
Right. Okay. So bottom line on top, the answer is very little under this administration, and what it's already signaled will be its approach. Of course, this administration is still young and, dare I say it, erratic, so anything can happen. But so far, I don't think there's much room for the types of agreements that could bring ASEAN into play with the US in promoting this rapidly growing area of trade. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope Wendy is right, that there will be these sectoral plurilateral agreements that might come to fruition, but I can't see it given the current orientation of the incredible focus on not friendshoring anymore, but reshoring. And I think that's where the problem lies. And it's unfortunate because services trade in general and digital trade in particular, very rapidly growing areas of trade globally, including in Southeast Asia, and barriers to such trade is still high. So policy reforms and agreements could support and accelerate this growth for mutual benefit. But you mentioned ASEAN's DEFA, the Digital Economic Framework Agreement. You're right, it's moving slowly because this is a highly diverse region. Perhaps, one of the most diverse regions in the world, and capabilities and the level of preparedness varies greatly by country. And concerns about, say, data security also varies greatly by country. And this is limiting this sort of regional agreements from moving forward more quickly. But progress is being made through the small numbers approach. in bilateral and trilateral deals initially amongst like-minded countries. I don't like using the term friends, but you do the deal with the countries at similar levels of development and capability and preparedness, and then you open it up. And this has been spearheaded in this region, at least, by Singapore, which has signed several high-level agreements with CPTPP members, like Australia with the Digital Economic Agreement, and also Australia, New Zealand, Chile with the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. And that's opened up now, and others are looking to join, right? So most of these reforms are naturally multilateral in nature. And even if they're negotiated bilaterally initially. So in the small numbers game, you can get the breakthroughs. It's easier to go further and deeper, get agreement on difficult issues, and then you open it up. And it's naturally multilateral because it's either difficult or costly to prevent free riding once these agreements are in place. And that's not a bad thing, right? So once you have the standards in place among the small group, you allow others to come in on a voluntary basis. And they can then agree and then adopt these measures, and it's mutually beneficial. Again, the current position of the US administration is to focus on resilience almost at all costs, right? President Trump has said that the US must have an ability to produce semiconductors at home, and is trying to bully and or bribe TSMC to shift production to the US. This is not the way to grow this sector, right? These types of so-called resilience policies are also having unintended spillover effects on other industries affecting this Southeast Asian region. For instance, the ban on access of Chinese firms to super chips to prevent their military use is also affecting technologies in the EV sector, electric vehicles, self-driving vehicles, and so on. And this is reverberating through out the regional supply chain because of the high level of interdependence. ASEAN supply chains in manufacturing are still largely China-centered, and this hasn't changed very much despite all the relocations that have taken place. This is negatively affecting this region, but also the world economy, including the US, and of course, it's affecting the green transition. So I think we heard earlier from Professor Todo about win-win propositions. They are difficult to find, but lose-lose propositions are also difficult. But this is a classic case of a lose-lose proposition. Pursuing this type of reshoring for an industry that's naturally global, that grows because of multilateral rules and openness, not through alliances with only friends, or worse still, through this incredible desire to reshore everything. I think I've been negative enough, so let me stop there.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks for sharing that. And I think, there are a lot of challenges in that digital space. Really interesting, again, to hear your perspectives from outside the US on the US moves and the direction that things are going in. So thanks for sharing that. Iman, I'm going to turn to you now. And what we had, during the last administration were a few new initiatives, including Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. We know that President Trump favors bilateral arrangements generally. And during the campaign, he said, or it sounded like he might pull out of IPEF, although, touch wood, it seems like he hasn't done it yet. I guess I'm interested in, if that were to happen, what would Indonesia and the broader Indo-Pacific, what would their response be? Do you think that IPEF, for example, through the supply chain focus there, will carry on without the US? Or what new initiatives do you think the region is working on or should be working on for supply chain security to move forward in this space without the US?
Well, Jen, I believe countries of Indo-Pacific have become accustomed to abrupt policy changes and pull-out initiated by the US from the White House. The TPP/CPTPP and NAFTA/USMCA are the case in point. I believe countries will adapt and adjust to the new reality or toward the new regional setting, if you like, in order to continue pursuing their economic interests among partners. Again, I follow the not to use the term friends there, that are partners. Whether the IPEF will carry on without the United States is really everybody's guess. If they see the strategic value in carrying it on without the United States, I believe they will carry on with the IPEF. However, should the IPEF cease, countries in Indo-Pacific need not to reinvent the wheel by introducing a new initiative. We have APEC, we have ASEAN, we have ASEAN +1, and the RCEP, to name just some existing regional platform. We may need to make some adjustment to this framework or platforms to make them relevant, responsive to specific concerns, and of course, future shock resistant. So again, I think everyone in the Pacific will be just fine. They will find a way to adjust, adapt to the new reality. But of course, we wish that there are some higher degree of certainties from the United States on what should we do together in this region, rather than following one particular partners and containing or cornering someone else in this region. So I think that's quite general observation that I could make.
Thanks very much, Iman, and definitely take your point that there are, of course, a number of other arrangements already in place in the region which do facilitate supply chain cooperation. So, hopefully those can be further strengthened as well. Professor Todo, I might ask you next. I mean, obviously Japan was where IPEF was launched. It's also spearheaded the G7 leaders' statement on economic resilience and economic security back in May 2023, which highlighted the importance of strong supply chains. In your view, what do you think is most at risk if the US pulls back from its leadership on building supply chain resilience in the region? And do you think Japan is ready to take a leadership role in its place if the US pulls back? Over to you, Professor Todo.
Okay, thank you. Before answering to these questions, I want to mention that previously Wendy mentioned that the countries need assurance that the U.S. will not impose additional tariffs, and I fully agree with that idea. So that's why I previously emphasized the importance of our collaboration. Cooperation between the Japanese and the U.S. governments about to remove policy uncertainty. So I just want to emphasize that. And so about the Indo-Pacific or IPEF, supply chains. Of course, if the U.S. shrinks supply chains in the Indo-Pacific region, the largest risk is that China will expand the supply chains in the region even more. And as a result, the Indo-Pacific and the Global South as a whole will rely more on China and are less willing to strengthen supply chains with the Western countries, including Japan, South Korea, and Europe. Then supply chains of the West will be more vulnerable. So, of course, if the U.S. pulls back, it's a very serious problem. But I still hope that President Trump is interested in the Indo-Pacific region from his own economic perspective. In fact, the need for economic cooperation between Japan and the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific region was mentioned in the joint statement of the Japan-U.S. summit. And actually, as many people, as Wendy and other people emphasize, for the U.S., expanding supply chains in the Indo-Pacific region is quite important to strengthen its supply chain resilience. So, the U.S. policies should encourage, not discourage, friendshoring or other term, I'd say, to the global south or Indo-Pacific. And one obstacle for the expansion of the U.S. supply chains to the global south or Indo-Pacific is differences between the Western countries, including the U.S. and the global south, in terms of democracy, human rights, labor, and environmental issues. So Western countries often impose strict regulations on suppliers in the global south in these issues. So these restrictions are often too restrictive from the perspective of the global south. And so these restrictions reduce supply chain ties between the West and the global south. And in this regard, President Trump seems to be more flexible to these issues. So I actually hope supply chains between the West and the global south will be expanded under Trump 2.0. And talking about Japan, of course, Japan should also expand supply chains to the global south. And it's not actually not enough now. And I hope that Japan and the U.S. will cooperate and create a new framework that takes a more flexible approach to these issues, like human capital and environmental issues, and does not impose too much restrictions on the global south. So this can be possible, for example, by utilizing maybe not IPEF, but the free and open Indo-Pacific, or maybe APEC or RCEP or whatever. So this kind of utilization of international frameworks is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Todo. And I might turn to Wendy now, just to pick up some of the points that Professor Todo was mentioning there. He talked about the importance of bringing the global south in and extending supply chains there. And you've talked before about the possibility of deals. I'm wondering if you could expand on what changes you would suggest to US policy to enhance global supply chains further, and in particular how we can engage the Indo-Pacific here and at the same time align with President Trump's America First approach. Over to you, Wendy.
Well, that's a very easy question. Look, I think the paper that Jane, that you drafted provides some useful recommendations going forward, including kind of, I think there are 5 principles for like the successful operation of these type of deals if we were to pursue, sectoral plurilateral deals that touch on, that deal with supply chains, resiliency and security. Just to repeat some of the principles, just to share, I think it's important that number one, for example, that if the administration wants to go down this area, that they pick really the key sectors of concern and interest, not do too much and try and address a whole bunch of sectors, but sectors like critical minerals and semiconductors and pharmaceuticals seem ripe for some kind of supply chain deals. Also, we've talked a lot about the need for certainty, and I think that's just critical for businesses. A lot of businesses will say, look, we get it if you want to put restrictions in, but just tell us what they are and just keep it constant, so then we can figure out how we can do our business in the context of this new policy framework. So I think promoting certainty would be extremely important. And earlier speakers mentioned, I think, we need to engage with countries from the global south here, that when we think of critical supply chains, it's not just working with Japan. I mean, remember during the Biden administration, our first critical minerals agreement was with Japan. And, I was thinking, well, how about all these other countries that actually have critical minerals? Shouldn't we be working with them? And so I think that's also important. And I would also just add, and I think it's always important to listen to the voices of our partners. And I think, Jane, through the interviews that you conducted with our partners throughout Asia as part of this report, you heard two things that seem very logical, but things that the U.S. probably isn't as good at as they should be. And that is making sure that whatever deals we reach deliver benefits for our partners and not just for the United States. And also the need for two-way engagement. In other words, we need to, if our partners are really going to be partners, then we should be open to hearing their concerns, their ideas on how to structure these things, and try and work with them, not only to pursue our interest, but also to ensure that their concerns are addressed. And when you do both, and I learned this lesson as a trade negotiator over the years, if it's really a win-win agreement and both sides feel that their concerns and their objectives have been addressed, the odds of that agreement being successful go up dramatically. If a country feels like it was somehow coerced or bullied into an agreement, then it seems to be less enthusiastic about implementing those deals. So anyway, those are just some thoughts I would put on the table that if the viewers want to understand in more detail, I would urge them to read the paper that we just launched today.
Thanks so much, Wendy. And can I just pick up on one point that you mentioned there and direct this to Iman, because there is a lot of talk about critical minerals. I'm just interested in whether you see alignment between Indonesia's resource policies, because you have some strategic controls on some minerals. And of course, the US is keen to work with partners on critical mineral supply. So interested in your perspectives, Iman, on where movement might be possible there and where you see Indonesia's policy going with, you've got a new government in place, what options you think there might be for working with the US on critical minerals there.
Well, yeah, it is quite a challenging question, I believe, because as I said earlier, the government in Jakarta is only 2 months in operation, and we're having a lot of issues, domestic issues now. I'm not clear whether Indonesia at this point in time and with the new government has a clear, solid policies in terms of capitalizing the critical mineral in Indonesia and building cooperation with the United States in that particular area. So for sure, we share the concern here that global trade should be fairer. But as discussed in your own paper, that what economic friends are for, where the United States or other developed economies may be considered unfair to such developing countries as Indonesia. Of course, as the paper goes to suggest 5 principles to enhance friendshoring, but at times when weaponizing of trade, tit for tat, trade coercion, etc., have become common, if not gaining more popularity, the push toward economic nationalism will garner more momentum, and it will affect how countries like Indonesia, put the policy and focus on the, for example, critical minerals and other sources that Indonesia owns. And this brings me to the issue of American first trade policy. The United States is amongst a few countries seen by others as a trendsetter. And I observe these days that Indonesia first, not only American first, has resurfaced as the main narratives in the government and parliament circles, ushering in the policies of privatization increasing domestic supplies. Yes. It has also led to the government adopting the forced investment policies. Perhaps you could observe the government discussion with iPhone, for example. And this bodes ill to the call for Indonesia to do more for the United States. Of course, there are rooms for alignment between Indonesia's resource policies and the United States' desire to work on resilient supply chains of critical minerals. But again, as I said earlier, Indonesia wishes to climb the ladder of supply chains and not get stuck as the supplier of raw materials. On this point, I have no particular idea how those two things are be reconciled. I'm yet to get a clear understanding on what Indonesia's international trade investment grant policies look like. But that's I could hear these days in Jakarta. So it remains to be seen how Indonesia make up our mind, come up with a grand trade investment policies, and be friends to everyone, not only to the US but also to anyone around the world. So that's perhaps my take, Jane.
Thanks very much, Iman. Yeah, and it certainly is challenging when we've got two new governments in place to try and work out exactly what the way forward is going to be at this point. But really value your perspectives on that. So thank you very much. We've just got time, I think, for one last quick question. I might ask Jay, just building on a bit what Iman was saying, and perhaps another option for moving forward with friendshoring would be around public-private partnerships. And I wonder, Jay, if you could just share what do you think are the realistic opportunities for public-private partnerships as a future way forward for US friendshoring policies, in ASEAN?
Right. Okay. Well, let me start by saying that, from the ASEAN perspective, as I read it, this whole concept of friendshoring is a bit bizarre, right? For resilience. I mean, if you look at our supply chains in this region, as I mentioned, they're still China-centered. And many ASEAN countries have difficult relationships with China. The South China Sea, number of these ASEAN countries, they are claimants on different parts of the South China Sea, but this has not affected a growing and thriving economic relationship, right? So the supply chain is resilient despite all of these difficulties, right? So this need to suddenly, increase resilience by turning only to countries you don't have any kind of geopolitical difficulties with seems unusual, I think, to countries in Southeast Asia. Okay, so that's that's what I wanted to say in terms of how we view friendshoring, which is the theme of this seminar to some extent. But public partnerships are, of course, critical. I think an issue in this respect for Southeast Asia is the extent to which the public sector recognizes the realities of the private sector, right? I think, the importance of China in the global economy is understood by the private sector in the US, but not by the public sector. And the public sector trying to help the private sector by increasing resilience, by marginalizing China, is actually doing it a great disservice. And so it would benefit, I think, US policymakers to listen more closely to what the private sector has to say and actually is doing, right? China is here to stay. They're not going away. You cannot move China out of your supply chains, right? It's there somewhere behind every other supply chain. And that's what you have to live with. And I think attempts to try and remove them will actually be counterproductive and fail at great costs. Public-private partnerships would work a lot better if the public would listen more to the private and take a lead from what the private sector has done and is doing. I guess at the moment this means Elon Musk because he has the ear of the president. But so far, his focus has been on internal issues, not on the trade front. The trade advisors to President Trump, I think we all know, have a very bizarre view of how things work. And there's not much hope that will come up with any kind of sensible policies on either trade or on public-private partnerships. So I'm sorry, but I can't be any more optimistic than that.
Thanks very much, Jay. Yeah, and certainly highlighting the importance of engagement with the business community and hearing directly from them is something that we heard a lot in our interviews with the region as well, and something we included in our report. So, but with that, it's actually just after 9 a.m. Eastern, so we're going to wrap this up now. I want to thank our panelists for this really insightful and enriching discussion today, especially for our Asia panelists who had to join us late into their evening. So thank you very much. I'm certainly going to be reflecting on many of the things that were said this morning. And I also want to thank our viewers for joining us today. And if I did not get to your question today, I do apologise. So finally, just before we sign off, another quick reminder about our new report on friendshoring, which you can find on the SB website. So please do check it out. Thanks, everyone, and have a lovely day or evening wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.